What's up everyone? So today's video is going to be about the horror comedy novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Today's video is going to have both a spoiler-free section as well as a spoiler section. The first half is going to be mostly spoiler-free, and then I'll let you know once I start diving into spoiler territory. It'll all be in one section. The spoiler timestamps is also going to be in the description down below, so you can check that out too. I read this book in mid-May and I rated it 3.75 out of 5 stars. This is the third Grady Hendrix book that I've read, along with Horrorstor and my best friend's Exorcism, and personally I consider this to be my second favorite of those three. Horrorstor is definitely my favorite Grady Hendrix book so far, I have to say. I would say that the level of humor and the sense of humor in general in Southern Book Club are closer to Horrorstor rather than my best friend's Exorcism, but I found that it did get darker and also spookier than both Horrorstor and my best friend's Exorcism, which I can't say today apparently. I keep stumbling on that. Anyways, personally, I didn't really find Horrorstor and my best friend's Exorcism to be super scary, although I know my partner did, so that definitely depends on you as a person and what you find freaky, but yeah, for me those two, They didn't really hit that kind of scary factor for me. For me, Horrorstor had really awesome humor that did an amazing job at reflecting the world of corporate retail culture in a really, really funny way, as well as the reality of minimum wage jobs. So this book is single POV horror comedy, like I mentioned, and it follows a woman named Patricia who's new to her neighborhood. She's a stay-at-home mother and a housewife who spends the majority of the time, as you can imagine, taking care of her 2 children, as well as her husband, actually. In order to make friends and just kind of get out of the house in general, she decides to join a local book club, but her membership in that book club is pretty short-lived. Basically, soon after the book starts, Patricia and a group of other women from that book club wind up ditching it and forming their own new book club, basically because the leader of the old one keeps trying to force them to read only the great Western classics, I guess you could say. They end up starting a new book club of their own that they don't even want to call a book club, and their focus there is mostly true crime. And eventually they decide that, hey, we're reading too much true crime, so let's mix things up a bit, so they add horror and thrillers to their true crime book club. As you can expect, one day their reality kind of turns into its very own true crime horror story, as unnatural things, kind of like the title suggests, start to happen in their neighborhood as well as surrounding neighborhood as well. As far as themes go, kind of like Horrorstor did with corporate retail culture and devaluing minimum wage retail jobs, Grady Hendrix is also using horror in Southern Book Club to highlight social problems like misogyny and the way that housewives and stay-at-home mothers are often infantilized and devalued by the men in their lives as well as by society at large. He's also obviously referencing issues like gentrification and racism in the southern United States, and he's blending them in with vampire horror. If you've read a lot of vampire horror, you will probably have noticed that it does actually work quite well with topics like gentrification and racism in particular. I will say again that the humor in this book was really, really up my alley, especially the first half. It had me cracking up throughout that book. I also think that Grady Hendrix handled the kind of like ick factor and the gore factor pretty well for the most part. There were some really, really gnarly descriptions that were really well done as far as I was concerned, and also really made me squirm for sure. One point in particular, I was just like yelling "ew" for like 5 minutes. My partner was laughing at me because she knew which part I was at. She has read this book before I have. But yeah, I couldn't look away. It was just one of those moments where it's so gross that it's also just so good as well. And I'll elaborate on that more in the spoiler section that's coming up in a few minutes. But before I do hit that spoiler section, I did want to talk a little bit more for the folks who haven't read the book about why I decided that this was more of like a 3.75 out of 5 star read for me instead of going higher. And the main reason for that was that as much as Hendrix was focusing on issues like misogyny and gentrification and racism, there were sections that felt for me like they were actually running counter to what his intentions seemed to be. And what I mean by that is that there's certain sections that came off like he was perpetuating those things or replicating them at least, kind of instead of addressing them or calling attention to them, if that makes sense. And I do find that that is something that can sometimes happen with authors, and especially if the authors are trying to represent a type of oppression that they have not themselves personally experienced. And of course, I'm not saying that this issue is limited to those authors, but I do find that's the case most of the time anyway. And I'm also just want to be clear here, is I'm not saying that people shouldn't be trying to portray types of oppression that they themselves have never experienced. That's not what I'm saying at all, because I do think that more people should be trying to portray those things. I'm just saying that it does show that this probably does need to be a part of an ongoing conversation and an open conversation within our communities. But yeah, I'll be more specific in the spoiler section that's actually going to start right now. So this is your warning. If you haven't read this book and want to avoid spoilers, please stop watching right here, right now. Yeah. Alright, so it is time to talk spoilers, and if you haven't read this, you'll probably want to exit this video right now. So going back, just because I feel like I need to get this off my chest, going back to the awesomely gross parts of this book, I don't know about you guys, but the scene where Patricia is hiding in the attic, covered in spiders and other insects, and Hendrix is describing this cockroach that's like slowly trying to force its way into her ear, was, for me, very possibly one of the grossest things I have ever read. And to be clear, I'm not actually even complaining about that. There was just something about this scene that was just so vomit-inducingly gross that made it also so good, if that makes any sense. I also just wanted to say, like, my sympathies to Patricia's ear, like, what the fuck, my god. The amount of horrible shit that was directed towards Patricia's ear, this woman's ear, in the span of a single book was just ridiculous and hilarious. The first incident of it of it being torn off was enough for one lifetime, but then this cockroach scene was just like, so yeah, I can't even, yeah, I don't know what to say. Like I said, there was a lot of me yelling, what the fuck, and just laughing my ass off throughout this book, that's for sure. Also, the scene of dismembering Jim, again, super gross, but also just so good, with some hilarious moments and very what the fuck moments, that's for sure. So now that I've gotten that out of my system, I will move on to kind of the things that rubbed me the wrong way, and again, that I mentioned caused me to drop my rating. Yeah, and it was mostly that third quarter of the book, but some other stuff kind of spread throughout it, but mostly concentrated in that third quarter. And I'm also interested if you guys feel the same way in the comments, so let me know as well. For me, as much as Hendrix was trying to critique misogyny in this book, I thought that there was moments where he was doing things like ridiculing women's bodies for no reason, or making women's bodies seem disgusting for no reason, or at just really inappropriate times that weren't really in line with it just being horror or horror comedy, in my opinion. The big one for me that I'm going to mention here was when James sexually assaults Patricia's friend Slick. There's that scene in the bathroom where Patricia is trying to help her and support her, but then there's this really, to me, unrealistic and also just really unnecessary moment where Patricia is describing her friend's naked body as looking basically like this groupie plucked chicken, I guess you could say. The passage is the one where Patricia notes that, and I'm quoting here just so you're aware, she says, Slick's breasts were small and pale, and the way she was hunched over, the way her ribs stuck out, the way her breasts hung lifeless, she reminded Patricia of a plucked chicken. For me, for the life of me, I can't understand why this description is necessary at all. This woman has just been sexually assaulted and traumatized. Regardless of whether this is horror or not, she's in the bathroom, she's stunned, she's panicking, and you're telling me that her friend is going to be kind of mentally thinking about what her breasts look like, or comparing her mentally to like a plucked chicken. Like, for me, again, even if it is horror comedy, like, that just feels crass and insensitive, not to mention like totally unnecessary. What is that adding to the book in reality? I don't think this adds anything at all to it, in fact. Like, again, I said, I know this is horror, but I also don't think that writing horror means that you need to be ridiculing bodies of sexual assault victims, for example. The other thing, too, is, like, I'm not even sure you could argue that this kind of description or judgment is in line with Patricia's character as well. She never really comes across as someone who's super judgmental of other people's bodies or like criticizing her friends' bodies or anything like that. So it also kind of comes out of the blue, and I just think it was totally unnecessary. And just as far as realism too, like, with a situation like that, you would think that most friends would have a little bit more of sensitivity and wouldn't be automatically thinking about those kinds of details in this kind of a situation. It's just something that I noticed kind of popped up a couple times throughout this book, and it kind of bugged me. And for this scene more specifically, and I've actually heard a lot of really great horror panels that kind of touch on this issue, or basically looking at this pattern in horror where women's bodies, and especially women's bodies as they're aging, become the site of disgust or ridicule, or horror itself, and especially when they are being written by men. Like I said, I imagine this is actually unintentional on Grady Hendrix's part, but it is something that did bother me and kind of lowered my impression of the book as well, as I mentioned, and it's something that I think that as a community we should discuss and be aware of too. There were two other things too that kind of bothered me as well, and were the reasons behind me lowering my rating a bit. The first being that I'm not sure the sexual violence aspect that only really became evident when Patricia's teenage daughter Corey becomes a victim, whether it needed to be as graphic as it was. At times it actually felt sexualized and overly graphic, and that's not something that personally I'm that comfortable with. I'm admittedly, though, not a big fan of sexual violence as a plotline. I feel that it's become kind of overdone and often does tend to appear sexualized or overly graphic for no reason, or in a way that doesn't actually seem to serve a purpose. So yeah, that was my thought on that part. The second thing that I wanted to bring up was that at times I thought this turned out to be a little bit of like white saviorism, that the black community essentially had to wait for white people to decide to do something about James before anything actually happened. On the one hand, I felt like it was a bit white saviory. On the other hand, in order for systemic racism to end in our societies and in white dominant societies, it also requires that white people believe, listen, and act in solidarity with people of color. So I'm a little bit undecided on how I felt about this. I am aware that Hendrix wrote this book as a tribute in many ways to his mother and women like his mother, which is fine to me. So in that sense, it was always going to be more centered on white women just by its very nature, just with him wanting it to be kind of a tribute to her. But for me, there were just a few ways that black characters felt very kind of two-dimensional to me, and like they were just present to have things happen to them rather than having any real agency on their own or as a community. And I hope that kind of makes sense the way I'm explaining it. I don't know, but I am curious about what you guys think, so if you have any thoughts on that, please let me know in the comments. The last thing is actually, there was somebody who posted a question on the Goodreads page for this book, and they asked other people if they felt that the husbands in this book kind of got off easy in comparison. I kind of agree with that person in a way. Like, yes, they did lose lots of money, but they were never really forced to confront the fact that they had a predator in their midst, who was a really good friend, who was somebody that they trusted over their own wives, and they were supporting him. Or even that they were not listening to their wives, treating them like children, and just taking the side of a predator against them. Also, I really hated Patricia's husband. Like, I wanted to punch him I don't know how many times. He was a total asshole, as I'm sure anyone reading this book will probably agree. I'm glad that she divorced him, but I also wish that I just wish that he would be forced to face the truth of the matter, the fact that he was supporting a predator and treating his wife like garbage. I know that in many ways that this ending is kind of realistic in that sense, and that in many cases in reality people aren't forced to come to terms with what they've done wrong and the harm that they've done. But I guess I just wanted a more satisfying ending for me. Obviously the James ending was fairly satisfying, but yeah, when it came to the husbands and their role with this predator in the community, and who was having an effect on other communities as well, there was something that kind of left me unsatisfied. Anyways, I'm going to stop there because I think this is probably getting longer than I intended it to get. But let me know how you feel in the comments if you've read this book. Did you like it, love it, hate it, think it was just okay? Inquiring minds would like to know. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.